Three rangers disappear under mysterious circumstances. First, Eric Larsson disappeared in the snow, leaving only perfect footprints that ended in the void. Then Eric Peterson reported silent figures and vanished, along with dozens of unfamiliar footprints that led nowhere. Then Sarah Newton, her service jeep with its headlights on, and the engine running, as if she had never been there. These cases are separated by years and hundreds of miles, but they have one thing in common. They are inexplicable, and every time the radios are left behind, turned on, no signal. What is happening in America's national parks, and why are rangers the first to disappear? February 1988 was an unusually snowy month for Yosemite National Park. At the beginning of the month, a powerful cyclone swept through the Sierra Nevada, dumping heavy snow on the mountain passes. The thickness of the fresh snow exceeded 5 feet in some places. For most tourists, the season was closed, but patrols of high-altitude areas continued. The Badger Pass area is one such place, deserted, difficult to access, but mandatory for inspection after snowfall due to the threat of avalanches and blocked trails. That day, the patrol was led by Eric William Larsson, a 35-year-old ranger with 8 years of experience. His colleagues respected him for his reliability and calmness. He was one of those who consistently followed protocol. Tall and thin, with a habit of wearing 2 pairs of socks even in summer, he treated his job as a personal mission. The service base in Wavone received its last call at 11:14 a.m. He reported that he had reached the fork at the observation point. The snow was knee-deep. No avalanches had been spotted, and he was continuing along the route. He said this as usual, clearly without fuss, and did not come on the air again. When the duty officer tried to contact him at 1 p.m., there was no response. At first, they decided that he had simply gone into an area where the radio could not reach him. By 3 p.m., the alarm grew. There was stable coverage in the area where Larsson was traveling, and he rarely broke his communication schedule. At 4:30 p.m., management decided to launch an urgent ground search. A team was quickly assembled, 2 rangers and an experienced rescuer, and they set off on snowmobiles along a well-trodden trail. An hour later, at 5:50 p.m., they were on site. At the edge of a clearing, next to a snow-covered trail, one of the rangers noticed a black radio lying directly on the snow. It was turned on. There were no signs of a fall or handprints on the case. It appeared to have been carefully placed on top of the snow. There were no other traces around it, only a transparent chain of Larsson's boot prints leading toward the clearing. They ended abruptly in the middle of the snowy space, where there were no bushes, rocks, or patches of melted snow. The tracks led to the middle of the clearing and disappeared. It was at this point that Larsson seemed to have fallen through the ground. There were no traces of his return, no displacement of snow, no signs of an avalanche. Investigators described the place as abnormally untouched, as if no one had ever been there. One of the rangers wrote in his report, "The snow looked fresh, as if it had fallen during the night, but there were only his tracks in it, and they disappeared in the center." There, 3 feet from the disappearance site, they found another detail. A small piece of fabric frozen into the snow. It was a piece of a uniform. The rest of the equipment was missing. The next day, a full-scale search began. More than 40 people, 5 snowmobiles, and 2 helicopters were involved. They searched an area with a radius of more than 2 miles. No signs of movement, struggle, or bodily injury were found. The condition of the snow was extraordinary. It was untouched even near the radio. The snow cover was solid and did not collapse, and according to meteorologists' calculations, it could not have hidden human tracks in such a short time. There had been no avalanches in the area since December. There were no signs of wildlife, except for the occasional fox tracks nearby. One of the weather station recordings captured a strange noise on the ranger's standard communication channel between 11:30 and 11:37, approximately immediately after Larsson's last call. The recording was preserved on magnetic tape in the station's archives. The noise was described as jumping and muffled, with no voice or obvious modulation. Some employees heard it live and thought it was a glitch or wind interference. Later, experts from the communications service listened to the fragment. No one could say for sure what it was, The data on the anomalies in the frequency was sent to the archives. On the 5th day of the search, the Badger Pass area resembled a war zone. Helicopters made 6 flights a day, and rescuers combed through the snow with flags and probes. About 70 people were involved, including 3 professional climbers and 4 dog handlers. Despite intensive efforts, each day brought only disappointment. No new clues emerged. The only thing they managed to find was on the 4th day, 26 feet southeast of the disappearance site, when a rescuer stepped on something hard under a layer of packed snow. It turned out to be a piece of black plastic. It had Motorola markings on it, the same model as the service radio. But the one found on the first day had an intact casing. It was unclear whether it was a different device or part of unknown equipment. Later, when checking the serial numbers, it turned out that the fragment found did not belong to Larsson. With each passing day, investigators had fewer and fewer rational explanations. Various theories were put forward, ranging from sudden disorientation and a fall into a ravine hidden by a crack to an animal attack. But none of them explained the main thing: why the tracks stopped in the middle of an open area, why there were no entry or exit points nearby, and where the body was. Even the most skeptical participants in the operation began to admit that something beyond standard logic had happened to Eric. Particular attention was drawn to a story told by park employee Phil Taylor on the 7th day of the search. He recalled a similar case that occurred in January 1976, also in the Badger Pass area. At that time, a skier from Sacramento who had set out on a solo trip went missing. His skis were found stuck in the snow at the start of the descent, but there was no trace of him beyond that point. His body was never found. The incident was filed away as an accident. Taylor admitted that he only remembered it after seeing how Larsson's tracks disappeared so abruptly, as if cut by a knife. On the 9th day, the search was called off. The official reason was the worsening weather conditions and the danger of avalanches in the southern direction. The temperature began to drop sharply, and the forecast was already predicting -20 degrees at night. The operation was moved to a monitoring phase. Eric's parents were told that there was still a chance he could have reached a shelter or temporary refuge. However, he was already unofficially presumed dead. His mother, Karen Larsson, refused to leave Yosemite and continued to search the area on her own until she became hypothermic 2 weeks later and was hospitalized. In the spring, when the snow began to melt, a second ground search was conducted. Surveyors and dog handlers re-examined the area where the ranger had disappeared. This time, they were interested in the point where the tracks ended. Under a layer of snow, they found dense grass cover, with no cracks, burrows, or depressions. Spectral analysis of the snow and soil was conducted, but no abnormalities were detected. 8 months later, the case was officially closed as a disappearance under unclear circumstances. Larsson's service badge remained in the park's archives as a memorial exhibit. His family never received an explanation. None of the theories, avalanche, sudden disorientation, fall, animal attack, or deliberate departure, received any confirmation. No piece of equipment except for the radio was found. Some former employees who left the service in the early 2000s later mentioned the case in private interviews. One of them, who wished to remain anonymous, said, "Such cases are not uncommon, but if you work in the park, you are taught not to ask questions that have no answer." The morning of July 9th, 1997, began like dozens of others at the National Park Service headquarters in Bar Harbor. The weather was clear with a gentle coastal breeze and the usual briefing for rangers heading out on patrol. Among them was 34-year-old Eric Stephen Peterson, one of the park's most experienced employees, who knew the coastal trails of Acadia like the back of his hand. He was a man of few words, calm and reserved, but his colleagues respected him for that. Peterson was not prone to exaggeration, panic, or fantasy. Everything he reported was always true. That day he was scheduled to patrol the southeastern section of the park, including the trail to Otter Cliffs, a famous cliff overlooking the ocean that was popular with tourists. The weather was perfect, a windless morning, clear skies, and visibility for miles. Eric set out on his route at 8:45 a.m. He took his standard equipment with him, a radio, water, an observation log, and a pocket knife. He was wearing his ranger uniform and a light windbreaker. He was traveling light. Checking the route didn't require a tent or a large backpack. His signal was steady. At 9:38 a.m., he reported that he had reached the trailhead at Beechcroft Trail. At 10:21 a.m., he noted traces of a recent campfire outside the permitted area and left a warning. Everything was going according to plan. At approximately 11:05, he reported the following. "I see 3 people ahead. They are standing on the trail facing me. No contact yet. I'll try to approach them." The message caused slight confusion. There weren't many visitors in the park on a weekday, and no one had reported any routes in that direction. But that was no reason to worry. A minute later, Eric was back on the line. "They're not responding. They're standing there silently. They don't seem to hear me. Very strange. The distance is about 100 feet. The dispatcher confirmed receipt and advised him to approach cautiously. 2 minutes passed. Silence on the air. At 11:09, Eric transmitted another message, this time his voice sounding tense. "1 second, sir." The signal was lost. Eric Stephen Peterson did not make contact again. The first group of rangers arrived at Peterson's possible location at 1:40 p.m., just over 2 hours later. They expected to find either the ranger himself or, at the very least, his tracks. Instead, they found his radio lying in the grass about 16 feet from the edge of the trail. There were no signs of a struggle, a fall, or panic. Peterson's footprints did lead to the cliff, but they suddenly ended on flat ground. They literally disappeared. However, there were other footprints nearby, numerous tracks from heavy hiking boots that crossed, looped, and also ended abruptly in roughly the same radius. The soil composition and moisture content made it easy to read the tracks at this time of year. A tracking expert with 20 years of experience, who was called in to help with the investigation, later stated, "It feels like 5 or 6 people were standing here, but they didn't leave by the trail. They just ceased to exist here. There are no traces of retreat, only arrival." At this stage, the investigation was already underway. Given the urgency and circumstances, the Hancock County Search and Rescue Team was called in, along with several volunteers from among former law enforcement personnel. Over the next 24 hours, the entire Otter Cliffs area, including adjacent trails, rock ledges, and coastal slopes, was combed. Observation tents were set up, and patrols were conducted around the clock. No bodies, equipment, or signs of a fall were found. On the 3rd day, rescuers rappelled down the cliffs in the hope that Peterson might have fallen and lost consciousness. A search of the coastline yielded nothing. The area where the ranger disappeared became a complete mystery. The only thing left behind was his radio lying on the ground, and dozens of strange footprints leading nowhere. Rumors began to spread. One of the junior staff members on duty at the communications station that day reported anonymously that Eric's voice in his last message sounded as if he was barely breathing. According to him, there was a strange rustling sound in the air, like the faint murmur of water or a distant rumble. These details were not included in the official report. When the search was officially suspended 10 days later, one of the most inexplicable and disturbing records in the history of Acadia National Park remained in the report archives. However, Eric Peterson's disappearance did not fade into obscurity. Every few weeks, the area was searched again. In November of that year, the winter season began in the park, and rangers reduced the number of patrols on remote trails. The Otter Cliffs area was closed until spring, as were most of the coastal trails. Almost 3 months passed. In February 1998, precisely 121 days after Eric's disappearance, 3 tourists from New Hampshire arrived at the park. They planned to spend the night near the coastal cliffs, taking advantage of a brief warm spell. In the area of the western descent to the cliffs, they began to gather large stones to build a fire pit. One of the stones was unusually light and sank deep into the ground, revealing a hollow space beneath the roughly piled rocks. Inside was a piece of fabric. At first, the hikers thought it was the remains of someone's old gear, but when they dug a little deeper, they saw fragments of a rib, then a shin bone. Rangers were called to the scene. Forensic experts confirmed that these were the remains of Eric Stephen Peterson. His skull was shattered, but not as a result of a blow. According to the experts' conclusion, this was caused by prolonged pressure from stones. As it turned out, the entire skeleton of the ranger was found there in an unnatural position, bent and seemingly compressed. The strangeness lay elsewhere. On the outside of the skull and ribs were minor cut marks, as if they had been scratched by a multitude of sharp objects. None of them was deep enough to be fatal, but there were many of them, more than 200 all over the skeleton. It did not appear to be the work of an animal. Also, on one of the remaining fragments of the mold, there were traces of old dirt. Still, it was a strange bluish color with an unusual mineral composition. Analysis could not determine its origin with certainty. The subsequent discovery only made matters worse. 65 feet from where the bones were found, under the roots of an old fallen tree, another anomaly was discovered. A trampled area with hundreds of intersecting shoe prints leading from nowhere to nowhere. Laboratory tests later showed that some of the footprints did indeed match the shape and size of military boots from the 1960s. The rest were more modern, but without clear patterns. There were no reports of group movements on any of the nearby trails on the day of Eric's disappearance. Moreover, according to the archives for July 1997, only 2 tourists officially registered to spend the night in the southern zone, and both chose to stay on the other side of the park. The cameras at the entrance did not record any large groups. So where did the dozens of pairs of footprints come from? Rumors began to spread among the rangers. According to unconfirmed reports, a senior officer who wished to remain anonymous claimed that such observing figures had appeared in the area before. Still, they were not mentioned in the reports, only passed on verbally from one shift to the next. The essence of the stories was always the same. People stood by the trail, silent, motionless, often with their backs or sides turned. They did not respond or move, as if they were not living beings. One such story was recorded as early as 1982. Still, at the time, it was dismissed as the hallucinations of a newcomer. According to official data, the FBI did not participate in the investigation. However, a closed copy of the report was found in the park security archives, which were inaccessible to the internal database. After that, several routes in the Otter Cliffs area began to be patrolled by 2 employees at a time, and the number of lone patrols was significantly reduced. The case of Eric Peterson's disappearance and death is still officially listed as an accident with unknown circumstances. Despite the discovery of his remains, his family has not received a full explanation. The main question remains unanswered. Who were the people Eric saw on the trail? And why did the tracks lead to nowhere? Information about this case is periodically removed from local news. Some details have only come to light thanks to independent researchers. But the official version remains the same. The ranger died in an accident. In the spring of 1998, a new patrol shift arrived at Acadia National Park. The route through Otter Cliffs was restored, but in a modified form. The section where Eric's body was found was excluded from the main trails. New employees were not directly prohibited from going there. Still, during briefings, they were instructed not to linger in the area of the cliff and to always report any anomalies. Several young rangers were surprised at how detailed the instructions on using the radio were, including rules for what to do if no one answers on the other end, but the reception is normal. Against this backdrop of caution, internal information began to leak out. One of the temporary employees, who had only been working in the park for a few months, later wrote in a private blog that while patrolling Otter Cliffs, he came across a group of tourists standing with their backs to the cliff. He said hello, but received no response. The people did not move. As he approached, he felt a strange chill, even though it was July. He then, according to his account, backed away, climbed a hill, and looked back at the site, but it was empty. There was no one there. Such accounts were never officially recorded, but these stories continued to circulate among employees. Many recalled an incident in 1983 when a school group on an excursion to the cliff suddenly discovered a man standing at the edge who did not respond and suddenly disappeared. The incident was not reported at the time either. Perhaps that is why the death of Eric Stephen Peterson became so high profile. It was too real to be ignored. An interesting twist occurred in 2002 when a research team working on National Park archives dug up some old records. In one of the 1976 journals, a report was found stating that on the route near Otter Cliffs, there had been reports of people standing silently by a tree for 4 consecutive days. No one questioned them, and soon after, all mentions of them disappeared. Since then, there have been no official reports of disappearances in the Otter Cliffs area. Internet forums dedicated to disappearances in national parks continue to discuss the case. Some researchers point to coincidences, cases where witnesses report groups of silent people suddenly disappearing, leaving no traces and no trail. It remains unknown what exactly Eric Peterson saw on the trail that July day. Were they ordinary tourists, a mysterious mental state, or something else entirely? But since then, most rangers working in those areas have adhered to one simple rule: if you see a figure standing silently at the edge, don't approach, ever. Sarah Elizabeth Newton, a 30-year-old National Park Service employee, was considered one of the most reliable and disciplined rangers assigned to the eastern part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. A native of Knoxville, Tennessee, she had been working in the park for 6 years, patrolling remote areas along gravel forest roads, checking trails, observing wildlife, and reporting fire hazards. She was known as someone who never deviated from her schedule, never ignored her radio, and indeed never abandoned her equipment without reason. That is what made her disappearance in October 1994 so alarming. On Saturday, October 9th, Sarah set out on a solo patrol along Indian Gap Road. This old country road runs through a densely wooded area between Newfound Gap and Cherokee Orchard. She was driving a green Ford Bronco service Jeep with department license plates and equipment inside. Radio contact was maintained until 3 p.m. She checked in twice, reporting that everything was fine. The last message came in at 3:14 p.m. Sarah mentioned that she had turned onto a side road to check an old parking lot by a creek. When she didn't report in by 4:30 p.m., dispatch didn't raise the alarm at first. There had been delays due to poor signal reception in the past. But by 6 p.m., when Sarah had not returned to base and was not responding to repeated calls, her partner on duty, Douglas Lane, began his own search along the presumed patrol route. At around 7 p.m., he found the service Jeep on an unnamed forest road in an area known locally as Colville Ridge, a narrow, winding road with dense vegetation and steep slopes on both sides. The car was parked at a bend, the headlights were on, and the engine was running. The driver's door was ajar. Neither Sarah nor any signs of her presence were to be found anywhere. There were no signs of an accident, a struggle, or tire tracks from other vehicles or footprints, except those left by the SUV's tires. Inside, the duty log was open and the radio was in place and working. Sarah's shoes, documents, cap, and jacket were all in the car. The trunk was closed and contained a first aid kit, a supply of water, and a set of tow ropes. A call to the Park Service prompted the emergency deployment of a search party within 40 minutes. The first wave of rangers arrived at the scene at 7:40 p.m. with flashlights and dogs. Strangely, the dogs refused to follow the trail from the car. They sniffed the seat and the ground near the doors, but did not detect any scent. That night, a light breeze blew, with no precipitation, and the temperature was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. A search of the surrounding area yielded nothing. Sarah seemed to have vanished into thin air. She didn't even leave a footprint. The next morning, air support and volunteers joined the operation. They combed more than 5 square miles in a radius from the point where the Jeep was found. No signal, no clothing, no scraps of fabric, no blood, no hair. There were no traces of the missing woman in the ditch, the stream, or the bushes. One of the investigators said in his report, "We found no evidence that she left the car on foot." It was precisely this inability to reconstruct the last seconds of her presence that gave rise not just to alarm within the team, but also a strange, oppressive feeling. The Jeep was running as if she had stepped out for a second and never returned. But then, where could she have gone in a matter of seconds without leaving even a footprint on the damp, soft ground? In the days that followed, the area around Colville Ridge turned into a coordination camp. Dog handlers, rangers, Military volunteers and firefighters were all working there. A helicopter flew along the forest border from Newfound Gap to Tri Mountain Ridge, circling along the ridge. But even from the air, the area showed nothing suspicious. No broken trees, no traces of a fire, no bright spots of clothing. Sarah disappeared literally dozens of steps from the car, which was running and lit, in the middle of the road, where even at noon a rare animal would dare to approach. Her brother, Jeremy Newton, a former Marine, arrived that evening and immediately joined the search. He claimed to know Sarah's habits well and did not believe it was an accident. He followed the streams, descended into the lowlands, climbed along the cliff line, anywhere where it would be possible to slip or hide, even by accident. He was the first to notice two strange details that were not included in the official report. First, about 190 feet from the car, he found an area with a long indentation in the grass, as if someone had dragged a long, heavy object, like a backpack or a body, across the ground. But this area began and ended in the woods, with no clear traces. Photographs were taken, but they were not included in the case file. Secondly, he noticed that one of the plastic water bottles from the car had been cut on the side, as if with a knife. No fingerprints were found on it. By the 11th day of the search, the area was cordoned off. The official version: possible criminal involvement or a security threat. In an unofficial correspondence, one of the investigators wrote, "The area is like a trap. Everything leads back to the car, but nothing leads away from it." 3 weeks after her disappearance, 3 miles to the south, a group of local hunters discovered a strange trail. In the damp earth near a dry creek bed, there was a single distinct footprint, a woman's boot, the same size as the one Sarah wore. The problem was that the boot was turned toe down on the slope toward the stream, and there were no second prints or skid marks nearby. It was as if she had been standing on the edge and had disappeared without taking a second step. After that, the investigation had no working hypotheses left. The body, clothes, weapon, everything was gone. No animal attack, no accident, no voluntary departure. Everything remained in place except the person. A year later, in November 1995, one of the senior rangers, William Crawford, who had retired, gave an anonymous interview to a local radio host. He claimed that there had been 3 reported disappearances in the Colville Ridge area over the past 30 years. One was a boy from the camp in the 1970s. The second was a fisherman in the early 1980s. None of them were ever found. He also said that in 1991, 5 dead raccoons were found 2 miles east of this area, lying within a 50-foot radius, with no visible injuries. It was decided at the time that they had been poisoned, but veterinary analysis showed no toxins. Their lungs were as if they had collapsed, as if after a sudden decompression. No one directly linked this episode to the disappearances, but it was mentioned in official reports. Sarah was never found. Neither her body, nor her personal belongings, nor her bones, nor her clothes appeared a year later or 10 years later. Her case remains open to this day, and in the official archives of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Rangers, there is a separate note on her file. No physical explanation for her disappearance. To this day, new recruits going out on patrol in the area are instructed to maintain radio contact every 15 minutes. Do not stop the car without a reason, and always go out on patrol in pairs. Sarah Newton is not just a missing employee. Her case is the line beyond which even experienced rangers stop making logical conclusions. If you found this interesting, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon. This will help us continue to release videos like this. Write in the comments which story you find the most mysterious and what you think is happening in these places. Take care of yourselves, and we look forward to seeing you in our subsequent investigations.